Today, we're going to take a deep dive into tiny home living. Yes, tiny home living. Is tiny home living right for you? Well, we're going to find out today. Ever feel like your house is full, but your life is empty? You're not alone. Across the country, seniors and people are ditching big homes, cluttered garages, and stacks of stuff, and downsizing into tiny homes, cabins, or even converted school buses. And boy, let me tell you, I have seen some absolutely beautiful converted school buses when you get, the videos from the inside and, you're not even paying any attention to what it is. And then people walk to the outside and you're going, I can't believe it was a school bus. But is it really the dream that it looks like on TV? Well, today we're going beyond the Instagram reels and telling the real story of retirees who made the leap. Hi, I'm Brett, and this is Retirement Today. And today's story is, to me, it's about freedom, simplicity, and how sometimes less really is more. But don't worry, we're not just giving you bullet points today. I am going to give you the real life side of things. Because the reality is, just recently, my next door neighbor, my landlord, my good friend, had a brand new 20-foot container in his yard. And I'm thinking, now what is he up to? He doesn't need another storage unit. But instead, when questioning him, I found out he was building a tiny home. And this was container number one out of 4 containers that were going to make this absolutely beautiful drawing, at least, of a tiny home. So let's face it, retirement isn't always palm trees and patios. It's also rising costs. And I think on this episode, that is probably one of the most important things to consider when you decide that you're going to retire. You have a nest egg or a certain amount of money, and that certain amount of money has to last a certain amount of time. So these rising costs and maintenance bills and space you no longer need that you're paying for, and let's be honest, a lifetime of stuff that's hard to let go of. Well, for me, it's been exactly a year now that we have been solely in the motorhome. Just a little over a year ago, we took all of the crap in the garage and all the crap in our 3-story home and put what we had to have in a storage unit. And what we didn't have to have, well, we were the king of Craigslist and Facebook Marketplace because we needed to get rid of stuff. We weren't having, I was not about to go out and try to find a 6,000 square foot storage unit. So we put all the treasures in a storage unit, and into our motorhome we went. So let's talk about some of the people who have decided that tiny home living, or a motorhome, is a great alternative. I met a gentleman, his name was Steven. He was a retired artist. He thought that moving into a tiny home in Oregon would bring peace. Instead, it brought 4 months of red tape, $10,000 in inspection fees, and a bureaucratic nightmare that he never saw coming. And this is not what they show you on Tiny House Nation. This is real life lessons, and sometimes the dream has zoning laws. Talk a little bit about why people still do it. So why are so many people choosing the tiny life? Because the idea is really powerful. And I think the greatest part of that idea is shedding all the junk that we have in storage units. And I saw a statistic one time that, and this was probably 10 years ago, that 55% of Americans have some sort of storage, whether they're paying for a storage unit or a shed in the backyard, but 55% of Americans have a storage unit. Is that utterly outrageous or what? No wonder why storage units are going up on every street corner. It's about freedom, freedom from the junk, freedom from the stuff, and just about what you need. About saying, I want to live more simply. I want to spend my time on things that matter. Tell me the truth in the comments below. Would you rather clean the garage or go spend the afternoon with the grandkids at the park? I think that was a much easier decision than most in life. All right, we're going to take Ryan. Ryan was a traveling outdoor photographer who lives in her tiny home on wheels in the Bay Area. And here's another aspect of tiny homes. A lot of people will park their tiny home on friend or family's property. And ironically, it keeps a really low profile, and you get to live the way you want with minimal utilities. In her project, she thought that it would be a 5-year thing. And when she came to the 5-year point, she thought she'd be building her own home, and the tiny home was never meant to be forever. Well, after living in the tiny home for 5 years, she decided that the tiny home was the rest of her life, and it was just enough. So let's take a minute to talk about the pros. One of the key aspects of tiny living is the lower cost of living, easier upkeep, encourages minimalism. And here's where the real education becomes. You know, when you go to the container store and you're just standing in the back while your wife is trying to find some kind of container that's going to go under the kitchen sink and fit, you're sitting back going, okay, how much longer? How much longer? How much longer? Well, that story totally changes when you get your rear in a motorhome or a tiny house, because managing those storage containers is key, because all of your goodies, your firearms, your camera, all the things that you love to do as hobbies need to have a place. So the other thing is closer connection to nature and a sense of independence. So nature, what the hell does that mean? Well, it means that a tiny house can be parked typically in places that a home is not going to be built. And I love the aspect of off-grid. I have a friend right now building a tiny house in the middle of the woods in Washington. And he has 2 sources of power: solar, which is good for about 80% of the time, and he has a gen set run on propane. So no real emissions, and solar. So he chose not to get batteries because he felt that the gen set was going to be cheaper than running a set of batteries. And I think in a couple years, he's going to find that the batteries make sense as well. All right, let's talk about some of the cons. One of the biggest problems with tiny homes and container homes is most zoning departments are confused about what is legal and what's not legal. The other thing is lack of privacy. Hosting guests is difficult, no different than a motorhome, and constant need to stay tidy. So you can't just close the door and run from your junk. Your junk is now very few things, and there's no door to close to hide your junk. All right, we met another couple at Las Vegas Motor Coach here in Las Vegas, and they have a couple tiny homes. And I asked them, how does that compare to square footage from the motorhome to the tiny home? And they said their favorite tiny home they have out of 2 was a farmhouse style, and it was 311 square feet. And I mean, yeah, they count it down to the 11. It's not just, hey, it's roughly 400 square feet. No, it's 311 square feet. Style in tiny homes is important. And in this case, it was a farmhouse, and it was absolutely beautiful. I think we got some pictures here. They told us it's perfect, but when one person is sick, there's a whole new problem. And that's no different than a motorhome. When one of us is sick, guaranteed you're going to get it too. It's honest, it's real, and it's working for some and just not for all. I think that some people prefer space and they have to live that way, and others can live in a tiny space. And I think if you're going to live in a tiny space, you need to pick up a motorhome for a month or so and go live in a tiny space on the road, and you're going to be amazed. So let's talk about the truth. Tiny home living is a lifestyle, just like a motorhome. It's not a life hack. It's not being trendy. It's about being intentional, about asking, what do I want from this season of my life, and where would I like to spend it? And sometimes it's a transition. Many use tiny homes as a temporary bridge. And, you see that a lot in RV parks where there are people that are working on construction sites that are in a specific area, and they call it a tiny bridge. So they've got a home and a travel trailer or a tiny home while they work a job. Well, what happens, I think, after talking to a lot of people is they begin to really love the simplicity. It's a way to live lighter, travel more, and rethink what home really means. Have you ever thought about downsizing? Have you ever dreamed of building your own cabin, tiny home, converting a van, or living with less? Well, tell me in the comments. Tell me what you'd like to hear. Tell me what you'd like to see, and we'll get it for you. Also, in the comments, type tiny home, and we'll send you the free tiny home checklist. Don't forget, hit like, subscribe, and share this with a friend who's thinking small to live big. Tiny home isn't just a trend. It's a conversation about freedom, about the purpose, and about getting closer to the things that matter to you. Remember, you are the business, your life is the story, your passion is the product. Thanks for watching. Brett on the go for retirement today. We'll see you next time when we take this on the road and drive into motorhome living. Yes, freedom on 4 wheels. See you next time.